Hey, horror lovers, ready to question reality? These 4 stories aren't just creepy. They're the kind of nightmares that stay with you long after the video ends. You've been warned. Let's begin.
In all my years of work, I've developed a strange relationship with death. I see it as something purely physical. The body in front of me is just an organism who stopped living. That's all that it is. And yet, it took me by surprise to have her on my table. I'd seen her around the hospital before, excited, glowing, talking about what her life would look from now on. She was a bit distracted sometimes, saying that great things were coming, but I didn't expect her to die right before giving birth. She was found drowned in her own home, with writings on her wrists and on the back of her neck, and she'd been laying in her bathtub for days before her neighbor found her. She had no husband, no relatives. They expected me to rule it as a suicide. I didn't believe that since it made no sense. Why would she kill herself right before giving birth? Right before becoming a mother, a thing she'd been so excited about. I'd been called in the middle of the night to work on her. They said her body was already in a pretty fragile state, and I needed to be precise and fast before they could wrap this tragedy up. I won't weight you down with all the gory details. I'll just go over the process really fast so that you'll get an idea of what I do. First came some of the paperwork and observations, along with the external examination and photographs. I didn't notice anything besides the obvious signs of drowning and damage done by the 3 days spent in the bathtub. Although, if I'm being honest, but that might have been just me, I thought that the skin surrounding the writing was lighter than the rest and harder. Next came the internal examination. I've been plagued by a wave of sadness, not wanting to move on with the procedure, but I tensed up and kept on working. Again, the usual signs of drowning. I froze with the instruments in hand. I was the only one in the morgue, or at least the only one alive. And it might have been the lack of sleep or the general eerie atmosphere that was making me feel unsure of what I was seeing. There was no earthly way she could have made those carvings on her ribs, tiny carvings of the same symbols. My throat was dry, which made me feel like I was choking on air, and suddenly the collar of my scrub felt too tight for me. It wasn't my imagination. Her ribs were covered in these carvings. Could it be some bone-eating bacteria? I knew it was pointless to even ask that question because I knew it wasn't. I took out my phone to take a close-up of the ribs. I know that wasn't too professional, but I had no choice. The moment I took the picture, something clattered in the distance. I looked up to the door to the hallway. No one should be here. I took a sharp breath and carefully put my gloves back on, feeling the blood slowly drain from my face as I worked my way down to her amniotic sac. I was expecting to see something that would make my skin crawl, and I knew that no matter how hard I braced myself, it would still hit me hard. When I opened it, it was empty. There were no signs of a fetus. It was as if it had just disappeared, leaving her placenta and the umbilical cord behind intact. There was no baby there. I stepped back from her and took off my gloves. I rubbed my eyes. That had to be impossible. Her tummy had been perfectly round, and I'm pretty sure there would have been signs if she'd given birth before or after dying. It was inhumane, unnatural. Everything indicating a pregnancy existed, all except for the baby. I carefully closed her up, trying not to think about the missing baby and the symbols, then filled the report. I wrote suicide on it. I wasn't 100% sure of that. I didn't need to be. They'd been clear with the instructions, just get it done, fast. I creaked the door open and peered into the hallway. The clattering had come from the supply room, and I hadn't heard the door open or close, so what had done it was still there. I approached it slowly, holding my breath as if I were afraid to make a sound. I placed my hand on the doorknob and twisted. Like, it was locked. On the inside, I knocked. "Hey," I whispered, "is anyone there?" What followed was an unusual sound, something like someone sucking the air through their teeth. I looked back to the hallway, ending with the morgue. The door was swinging open. I couldn't remember if I'd closed it or not, and I didn't want to. I decided my job was finished there. I closed up and got into my car, then drove home in silence. I live alone, so me coming home at 3 a.m. would not disturb anyone. After doing my night routine and going to bed, I found myself twisting and turning, strange dreams pressing onto me, like the ones you have when you have a fever. I thought I heard a cry at one point, until I realized it had been my own. I opened my eyes after what seemed like minutes, to discover it was a little over 6 a.m. In the soft glow of the morning, my window had fogged up a bit, and I couldn't help but stare, perplexed, at the fresh print of a child's hand on the inside of the...
I like to think that I take my personal safety very seriously. I don't stand too close to the road while waiting for the walk signal. I have my location shared with my sister and mom. I keep my wits about me when I'm out in public, and I try not to dawdle after getting into my car. If I had only been more diligent about that last rule, I might not be in the situation I'm in now. Early this morning, just after midnight, I was sitting in my parked car outside of my favorite grocery store. I was exhausted from picking up a friend's evening shift, and so I stopped to grab dinner on my way home from work. The store is in an isolated part of town, but I had never felt unsafe in the area. Then again, I'd never been so late at night. The second I exited the store with my purchase, the old cashier closed up shop for the night and turned off all the lights in the building. For some reason, I did something I never do. I started eating in my car. As a precaution, I try not to linger in isolated parking lots, especially as a young woman who often has to run errands after dark. Maybe it was the hunger, or maybe the fact that, due to a recent breakup, my house hasn't felt all that welcoming in the past few weeks. In any case, I was in no rush to return home. I pulled up an episode of The Terror on my phone and settled in to eat. I enjoyed a few minutes of blissful peace and quiet before a shout pierced through the night. I looked up from my phone and was surprised to find a woman standing in front of my car, waving her arms at me. My car was parked right in front of the store, facing towards the building, and there was only a thin sidewalk separating my vehicle from the store's exterior. I hadn't seen her coming at all. It was like she had emerged from the brick wall before me. She rounded my car, coming to a stop beside the driver's side window. She then started pointing at the ground, the universal signal for roll your window down. Fat chance, I thought. Though she looked sane and kempt, I had no clue what her intentions were. In fact, I felt pretty vindicated in always locking my car doors immediately after entering. The woman, perhaps seeing I was making no move to exit my vehicle, then told me something no one wants to hear. "Hey," she shouted, "there's someone in your back seat." My mouth went dry. Time seemed to slow as 1,000 horror movie scenes raced through my head. I could almost feel the piano wire digging into my neck, the barrel pressing into my temple. I undid my seatbelt and prepared to launch myself out of the car. Now that the intruder knew I was aware of their presence, would I even have enough time to run? With one hand on the door handle, I stole a glance into the rearview mirror and saw no one. My car is a compact hatchback, meaning there is very little room for a person to hide in my cabin. Even in my exhausted state, I would have noticed someone upon looking into the mirror. My terror fading to confusion, I turned around in my seat, surveying the cabin with my own eyes, and confirmed that there was no one in my back seat. Click. When I turned back around, the woman had taken another step closer to my car. Her body was barely a foot from my door, and her fingers were wrapped around the handle. There were a few more deep clicks as she tried, unsuccessfully, to open the locked door. I raised my gaze, and she gave me an odd smile, as though she and I were sharing a private joke. For the first time, using the faint glow of the street lamp, I took a closer look at the woman's face. Her skin was stretched tightly across her skull, making her thin mouth and nostrils appear as though they'd been cut onto her. Her eyes were deep set and ovate, and her teeth seemed both too small and too numerous. I allowed myself a brief moment to gawk at the face before me, and then I threw my car into reverse and hightailed it out of the lot. For a few disheartening seconds, the woman held onto the door, keeping in step with my vehicle as I backed up. Luckily, she soon let go and I drove away, my mind racing with the realization that the woman was trying to bait me out of my car. Even more disturbing was the fact that it had almost worked. I wondered if she had others with her that I simply hadn't seen, and what she had wanted from me. I hoped I had narrowly escaped a robbery as opposed to something much more sinister. I got back to my house 20 minutes later. Still shaken from my encounter, I rushed inside the house and made sure that all of my doors and windows were locked. My exhaustion did little to soothe my nerves. My mind played tricks on me as I got ready for bed, conjuring up flashes of the woman's face in the dark corners of my house. Once I finally fell asleep, my fears followed me from the waking world. I had a long, vivid nightmare, most of which I've either forgotten or is irrelevant to this account. All I know is that when I jolted awake some hours later, it was to the sound of a frantic banging on my front door. I sat up in bed, unsure if I was still dreaming or not. My alarm clock read 4:17. It was far too early for someone to be knocking on my door, unless there was some kind of emergency, which, given the forcefulness of the knocks, there may have been. Slowly, I rose from my bed and inched towards the entryway. I had never before been in such a situation, and was at somewhat of a loss as to how to react. I didn't smell a fire, thankfully, but that didn't mean all was well. Suddenly, I heard a man's voice calling out my name in a questioning tone. It sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Who is it?" I called back. "Brian," answered the disembodied voice, and relief washed over me. My neighbor Brian lived in the house across the street. We weren't close exactly, but I often saw him walking down the block with his dog, Bailey. I turned on the entryway light, but as I was still in my sleepwear, I didn't want to open the door unless I had to. Instead, I called back to him. "What's the matter?" Well," he began. I heard his voice crack, and he cleared his throat. "Do you have someone over right now?" What I asked, my heart skipping a beat. "No, I don't. Why do you ask?" "Oh, the dog had to go out, and while I was in the yard with him, I thought I saw someone in your front window, someone who didn't look quite right." I stilled, feeling as though I were in some terrible dream. Turning around and glancing down the dark hallway, I wished I had turned on more lights on my way to answer the door. She followed you home, I thought. She's in your house with you right now. I was ready to bolt out the door into the cold, but by some miracle, I had just enough presence of mind left to consider my neighbor's words more carefully. Something was wrong. I stepped away from the door. "Are you all right, Brian?" He cleared his throat again, and when he next spoke, his voice sounded slightly different from before, as though he were testing out a new timbre. "Of course, I just got a bit of a cold here, but I still wanted to check in on you." My voice wavered as I voiced a question to my neighbor. "But your dog, isn't it a girl?" Brian didn't respond. My mind reeled in the torturous silence, trying to discern whether the threat was outside the door or inside the house with me. After a full minute of complete stillness, the handle to my front door began to move. It rotated downwards as far as it could before the lock stopped it, then shook as the person on the other side of my door pulled on the handle. This happened several more times as the person tested my lock. And then there was a powerful bang, as though someone had rammed into my door with all their might. After that, there was silence again. I stood frozen in place for another minute. I had no peephole, but I worked up the nerve to walk into the living room and peer through the blinds into my front yard. In the distance, walking down the street away from my house, was a figure. Although I couldn't see the face, something deep within me knew it was the same person who had tried to open my car door. I watched her walk away into the quiet night until she disappeared from my view. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. I split my time between roaming the perimeter of my house, looking for anything suspicious, and sitting in my kitchen running the events of the night over in my mind. The most likely explanation was that I'd been dreaming. After all, I'd nearly been baited into opening my door to a potential criminal just hours before, so it made sense that I'd have a nightmare about a similar situation. So, then again, I had never in my entire life had a dream so vivid. Maybe, somehow the woman really did follow me home. She easily could have stuck a tracker on my car, but how in the world did she know Brian's name? And how had she impersonated him so well? The sun is setting now. I haven't left the house all day. I've been too haunted by the idea of someone, or multiple someones, trying to draw me out into the open. No matter how many times I check the house, I still feel as though I catch glimpses of the woman in my periphery. Of her beady eyes and uncanny smile. I suppose I should try to get some sleep now, impossible as that seems at this point. I just needed to jot this down before I went to bed in case A, anything happens to me, and B, you ever think about blindly trusting the warnings of a stranger.
I am chronically online. I Google lots of things and people when I'm bored. I've Googled my own name before, along with friends, acquaintances, conspiracy theories, and random internet sundries. But last night was the first time I'd Googled my wife's name. And I found something I'd never forget. The first hit was an obituary. Of course, I assumed it was someone with the same name as her. Her first name is Emily, and her last name is pretty common. Not gonna share it here because I don't want to be doxxed. But I clicked it anyway, just out of curiosity. My heart fell through the floor when I saw a photo of my wife on the website. Blonde highlighted hair, dark eyes, and the dates matched up too, 19862012. According to this obituary, she died when she was 26. I met her when she was 27. There's no way, I thought. This must just be someone who looks like her with her name and her birth year. But I knew it was too many coincidences to be wrong. When I read the actual obituary, it only cemented things for me. It mentioned her love of horses, her volunteer work at a soup kitchen through her church, and her work as a biologist postdoc. So many details matched up, there was no way it could be a coincidence. What you looking at? I jumped as my wife came in from the kitchen and sat down next to me. On instinct, I slammed the laptop shut. Nothing, I said. Then, realizing how suspicious I looked, I added, I was looking at birthday gifts for you. For a second, her face froze, and I was worried she wouldn't buy my lie. But then she smiled, that warm smile I loved, crinkling her eyes at the corners. She said, coming to sit next to me. I swallowed. Yeah. She cuddled up next to me, but I felt completely on edge. The warmth of her skin no longer felt warm and inviting. In fact, a chill ran down my spine. After a few minutes, I extricated myself from her embrace. I don't feel good, I lied. I'm going to lie down. Aw, okay, she said, pouting. Before she could say anything more, I ran upstairs. As soon as I got on the bed, I brought up the obituary again. I stared at the grainy image of her face. It was definitely her. That warm smile, those mysterious dark eyes. There was no way it could be anyone else. I scrolled through some of the other results and I realized some of those too were related to her death. There was a Facebook memorial page, friends posting on it, names I didn't recognize, mourning her loss more than 10 years ago. The university she worked at had put out a statement with their condolences as well. But then I found something that made my heart stop. A news article nestled at the bottom of the search results page. Emily hadn't just died, she'd been murdered. My jaw hung open as I read the news article. Phrases popped out at me: no signs of forced entry, partially dismembered, and killer still at large. The news article didn't have a photo of Emily though, so maybe this was a different Emily? It had to be. It couldn't be my Emily who was sitting on the couch watching TV downstairs. A sound jolted me out of my thoughts. The door to the bedroom creaking open. Emily stood in the doorway, oddly still. The hall light was off, shrouding her face in shadow. Emily? I asked, my voice shaking. I came up to check on you, she said in a soft, cool voice. Thanks, I said, quickly turning off my phone and slipping it behind me. I'm feeling a lot better now. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear that, she said, her voice going lower. I tried to keep my cool as she climbed into bed with me. I lay there, stiff and cold, as she wrapped her arms around me. I love you, baby, she whispered as she cuddled with me under the covers. I love you too. So that's where I am now. I'm writing this from my phone as Emily sleeps next to me. I don't know if I'm safe here. I don't know who or what I'm dealing with. All kinds of crazy scenarios have been floating through my mind. Did Emily have an identical twin that died and she took over then twin's identity? Is she some horrible creature from folktales who killed Emily and took on her appearance? The more minutes that tick by, the wilder my theories get. None of them make sense. There's only one thing I'm sure of. Whoever or whatever I'm sleeping next to isn't the real Emily.
I never understood her hobby. Why on earth would you want to let yourself be swallowed by the depths of the earth when you could, I don't know, breathe fresh air, see the sky, be able to move, to walk? The Nutty Putty Cave incident was one of the many stories that had stuck with me, and I hated knowing she was somewhere out there, practically buried alive, exploring some godforsaken tunnel. I hated knowing that any time I saw her could be the last. I'd begged her to pick some other hobby that wasn't so risky. She refused. She'd always talk so passionately about the thrill of it. When you're down there, Jude, she'd start, and I didn't know whether to envy her courage or despise her carelessness. When you're down there, you move differently. You think differently. You're not you anymore, but someone more agile and quiet. Your skin glides smoothly through the rocks, through the guts of the mountains. It's something ancient and full of life. Time just stops and your heartbeat adjusts to the water dripping from the walls. Your eyes widen and embrace the darkness. And nothing compares to the first breath of fresh air once you're out. Every time she'd try to convince me, I'd cut her off. It's horrifying. You're essentially getting eaten by the mountains and hope they're kind enough to spit you out. All those tight spaces make my skin crawl. Imagine not being able to take a deep breath because some wall is pressing down on your back. I'd die. Last month, she wouldn't shut up about this new cave system she'd discovered somewhere in the north. A 5-hour drive, she said. I can't believe I never knew about this. It was so close to us all this time. My stomach dropped at the thought of her going on one of those adventures again. You know, there are better ways to spend your time. Bullshit, she laughed. Look, I'm safe. I'm not stupid. I wouldn't do it if I had any doubts that I would not return. You should come with me sometime. I was quick to refuse her, and she just smirked and shook her head. Whenever she set her mind on something, nothing could stop her. She sent me some texts, updates like 2 hours left or the picture of the entrance of the cave, but then the updates stopped. I'd learned to let her do her thing and just wait until she contacted me. And over the years, I stopped feeling so anxious every time she would cut contact for a while. I knew she didn't have any signal down there. I knew to just wait. The last update she'd sent me was around 10 a.m. It was midnight now, and as I tried to fall asleep, something wouldn't let me. I kept seeing her when I closed my eyes, imagining her down there, swallowed by the rocks. I twisted and turned in my bed, the same way she did, deep into the ground. My clothes were drenched in sweat, and I hoped she had just forgotten to update me and that she was out of the cave. At one point, my phone buzzed. I shot up and glared. It was a little over 3 a.m. It was spectacular. I rubbed my eyes and felt the weight lift off my chest. Thank God. I typed some shallow response, then finally went to sleep. She came home the next day. At first, I didn't recognize her. Her cheekbones were more prominent, and she hadn't washed herself. She was drenched in mud and smelled of rot. Her eyes were full of life, darting from one place to another, and her hands would not sit still. She didn't speak much. I didn't know what it was, but I assumed something had happened down there that scared her enough to change her mind. I felt relieved. Maybe she'd had enough near-death experiences to finally quit. I stayed in my room that day, mostly working. I heard her walk around the house multiple times, looking through drawers and cabinets, slamming doors. At some point, she stopped, and the hallway went silent. I was sitting at my desk, writing on my laptop. I could see the cracked door of my bedroom leading to the dark hallway, and a fraction of one of our tall white lamps. I was focused on the screen, so everything else was blurry behind it, just some shapes and colors mixing together. It's not like I paid much attention to the background. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I called it a night. I glanced up at the hallway, and something caught my attention. The white, blurry shape of the lamp wasn't there anymore. Did she move it? I opened the door wider and peered into the hallway. The lamp was in its usual place, which had never been visible from my desk. My eyes stung a bit from the monitor, and I knew my vision was tired, but I could have sworn I'd seen something white and still through the cracked door. I even assumed it was the lamp, because it had stood there for hours. Although, if I think about it, the lamp wasn't that tall. I don't even know what to think of that, but I have this knot in my throat as I'm typing this. It's so strange that most of the time, the human mind doesn't register peculiar things as peculiar and brushes them off as ordinary stuff. How many times had I seen something in the corner of my vision and just assumed it was some object, like a plant or a coat, when it wasn't? It made me realize how stupid we are as human beings. If someone wants to watch us, they can do it for as long as they please, and we won't know unless they want to. I turned my head to my sister's room. The door was shut. I wondered if she was sleeping. Carefully, I tiptoed to her door and gently twisted the doorknob. "Em," I whispered. She was sitting cross-legged on the bed in the dark, doing nothing. "Em, were you watching me? Watching you? Was look on you?" I thought I saw. She just stared at me, then her gaze slipped to a fixed point behind me. She followed something with her eyes. I almost snapped my neck, turning to see what she was looking at. Nothing was there. Are you okay? How was the cave system? Did you have fun? It's different down there. Yeah, I know. It's dark and damp and tight. No. Her voice was hoarse. She was studying her hands, turning them over again and again. "Look, I don't like what you're doing. This is just ridiculous. And I don't understand if you just want me to freak out and this is one of those pranks. If you don't tell me what you saw, I'll just assume you're lying for attention. It's really tiring to be your sister sometimes." She widened her eyes, still fixated on her hands. I thought she was deliberately ignoring me for a while, until she started coughing. Her cough became clearer and more controlled, until I realized at some point she'd transitioned into a laugh that sounded painful. She grinned at me, but her eyes were blank. Then she mumbled something that sent chills down my spine. She'd spit out the words so fast that for a good minute I didn't realize what she'd said. We were both silent, just looking at each other. I didn't know how to respond and was beginning to wonder if it was worth continuing the conversation. "You're tired, go get some rest," I began, but I got interrupted. "You need to come with me, Jude." "Where?" "I need to come with me and crawl under the earth." My chest tightened and the corners of my vision went blurry. "Stop." "Em?" She just stared at me. Then her eyes shifted away, out the window at the end of the hallway. I frowned, but before I could turn around to look outside, she quickly stood up and blocked my view. She sprinted to the end and pulled the curtains. What did she do that? "It's okay. Good night." She went into her bedroom, then shut the door behind her. I pulled back the curtains and stared into the darkness, looking for whatever the fuck she'd seen. The street was empty, apart from a car and a black trash can, some bushes, my neighbor's house, a bike, the streetlights. I pulled the curtains back. As I stepped into my room, a thought lingered in the back of my mind. It all happened in a few seconds, but it was enough to weird me the fuck out. We only take the trash cans out on Tuesdays when the garbage truck picks them up. It's Friday. I pulled back the curtains again, and the black trash can wasn't there anymore. Only, I wasn't even sure that's what it had been. When you see something off, your mind automatically ties it to something rational, some explanation. If I think more about it, it could have been someone crouched over. I shook my head. "Stop. You're disturbed. Go to sleep." As I typed this out in bed, I just couldn't help thinking about what Em had said to me. The two sentences were on a loop in my mind, and they affected me because they weren't coming from a crazy person. And Em has never lied to me, so she really believed what she'd said. In her bedroom, when she'd flashed me her best grin, I discovered what happens after death. You won't make it there.
That's it for tonight, but trust me, the next ones will be even darker. If you enjoyed these stories, make sure to like, subscribe, because you don't want to miss what's coming next. Stay creepy, and I'll see you in the next one.